Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Jeff and Kara Smith are the owners of Colorado Craft Beef, established in 1917. The family settled on a 320-acre half section just a half mile from the Colorado Craft Beef headquarters, where the company was founded and currently operates. The ranch now encompasses over 5,000 acres and it has been in operation for over 1,000 years. And Jeff and Kara, you can correct me if any of that's wrong. Last thing I want to say is I've personally enjoyed and eaten Colorado Craft Beef's boxes and ordered it for my wife and myself several times. The ribeyes and ground beef are incredible, as is the sirloin and the skirt steaks. And you can save at checkout and help support the show with the coupon code CCAST. That's CCAST. Welcome to the show, Kara and Jeff.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us today, Scott.
You bet.
Of course.
Thanks, Scott.
I think the first two clarifications, we've been in operation as Craft Beef for about 3 years.
Okay.
The family has operated here for 100, not 1,000 years.
Wow.
I think that was just a quick misnomer on your side.
Oh, yeah, I just misspoke.
No worries. I mean, I appreciate the 1,000-year mark.
That'd be crazy.
It turns into that, but I don't imagine we'll get to see that. And the ranch was originally homesteaded in 1913.
Yes, but officially they got their paperwork in 1917. So that's what's included on all of our branding is the 1917 date, because that's when it was official in the state of Colorado that the homestead had become part of our family operation.
Got it. Well, let's talk a little bit about the origins of Colorado Craft Beef. I think that's a great place to start. Why don't you tell us the story of the homestead and the ranch and how the company was eventually founded?
So I'll go ahead and start with one of two stories. There's really two that kind of encompass where Colorado Craft Beef came from. Of course, it is a foundation on my family multi-generational ranch. I'm fifth generation and our little girl is actually sixth. So there's a lot of history embedded here. And as you mentioned in your introduction, we're only half a mile from where my family originally did homestead. But in that, within the ag industry, we're always looking on how we pass it on to the next generation. So that was the first story. This was right before Jeff and I had moved back to Colorado. And we were helping my dad ship cattle off of pasture here. And it was about August timeframe. And of course, a nice storm came through. So we were all huddled up in the barn. And we were talking about what this may look like in our next generation. So, we were asking my dad of what do we need to know or what do we need to not do to be able to take the ranch into the next generation? And we asked him, we're like, hey, could we run this the same way you do? And he looked at us and he contemplated on that. And he said, no, you can't. And it's not because he's mismanaging the operation, but the times that we're in have changed so much compared to, how my great-great-grandpa homesteaded this place to how my dad is running it today. So he looked at us and said, that's just, you guys are going to have to find your own way. And that's part of where Colorado Craft Beef came from, was just looking at it of how do we continue on this ranch and take it into the new generation that we have today.
Got it.
And so Scott, the second story is, I grew up in the cattle industry and my education is in it and my career has been in it. So I go to multiple meetings a year. And at these meetings, we sit around a table as cattlemen and cattlewomen asking what we do to help connect with our consumer, because they've changed a lot from when our ranch was homesteaded and, even 10, 15 years ago. So we're contemplating this around a group of cattlewomen and men. And the thought was, we really need to do a better job connecting with our consumer. So I was like, well, the best way to do that is to go out and have a conversation with them and help them see where their beef comes from and feel good about that process. So that's the second story that kind of sparked the idea of going direct to a consumer with Colorado craft beef.
Very cool. And can you talk a little bit, let's go through the whole kind of supply chain, if you will, how you raise the process, how you slaughter the process. And then we can talk a little bit more about distribution and kind of your opinions on the direct to consumer. But would love for folks to understand, how Colorado craft beef is made, and some of the care you take in that whole process.
Perfect. Probably the most interesting part of the cattle supply chain, Scott, is how disintegrated it is in comparison to a lot of other protein markets. So Kara, being the lovable cow nerd that we refer to her as on the ranch, she really has a passion in unifying different sectors of the cattle economy to allow people to all share in a greater size pie. And the ranch isn't really set up for a cow-calf operation, so we don't have mother cows. We were actually able to use Kara's amazing relationship building ability to work with other partner ranches to actually secure their young calves to become Colorado craft beef. And I'll pass it over to Kara on some of the selection criteria she has with regard to genetics and all the things that really support the craft beef model, because, the cattle selection is not a haphazard decision. It's a very thought out scientific approach that Kara handles really well. And I hope to just be in the background and not have to think about science too much. So.
Sure. So within the craft story is, we're basically starting that before these calves are ever born. So keeping an Angus-based cow herd that really works best for our producers that we work with in our area. So keeping that in mind as far as our genetics, and then looking at how we select bulls to make sure that we have the most optimal eating experience, because there's so many of these traits that come out in the finished product that we can actually select for before these calves are even conceived. So the tenderness, the flavor, the everything that we love when we enjoy a steak, we can look at that from a genetic aspect and help gear it the best we can, but also keeping in mind that within the cattle industry, we have to balance our resources as well. So here on our ranch, we have different resources than, some say a partner ranch up in the Colorado mountains. They have different things that they need to manage within their cow herd to make it the most profitable they can, as well as the best use of their natural resources, whether that's water, grass, so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that we're looking at before these calves are ever born, and then moderating that frame size the best we can to consume less natural resources, because we only have a limited amount. We're in Colorado, but we're in kind of the northeast corner, so it's not necessarily the mountain environment, and we're pretty arid, so we don't get quite as much rain as they do in other parts of the world to be able to have green grass growing year round. So we're utilizing these resources, with a smaller frame cow, smaller frame calves, and getting them to that, the point where we convert them into beef at a different size than they may in some other places to optimize our resources, whether it's from cow calf to our individual segment of we call stalker, or, the backgrounding segment where we run on summer pastures, and then all the way into the finishing side, where I actually have a degree in cow nutrition. Surprisingly enough, that is a thing.
Very cool.
So I can craft the rations, what these cattle are eating, along with balancing some of the byproducts that we have in our great state. Because Jeff can attest to some of his connections within the farming industry and the seed industry, or even the brewing industry. there's a lot of byproducts out there that we can utilize and do on Colorado craft beef to help get these cattle to your plate. So Jeff, could you touch on that real quick?
Yeah. So a lot of the craft ingredients that we use in the finishing process come from specialty farmers or specialty processes, because Colorado is basically on the fringes of big ag, which means we have a lot of processing. There's a lot of malted barley or flaxseed or oil seed that's produced in this region that is great for cattle feed that isn't really available in other areas in the country. And the other flip side of that, Coors is in Colorado and they sell all of their spent brewers grains into the cattle feed industry, but I think it's something like 5 semi-loads a day. So we can't touch that. So what we've done is built a network of processors and producers that make these great products, and we've been able to retain their byproducts as feed additives to minimize the concentrate load, to maximize comfort for the cattle, while also providing an eating experience to the end consumer that it doesn't really match up with anything you can find in the grocery store.
Yeah, that's really impressive. And I think one thing I wanted to touch on with regards to finishing is some of the myths around grass finished versus grain finished, or what you're doing, which is craft finishing with a mix of grains and other materials. Can you talk about some of the decision around that? You mentioned, Kara, the fact that there isn't green grass growing year round where you are. So that's one element, but also I think there are some myths that, grass finishing is always better for the environment, always better for the cow, always produces more nutritious beef. All of those things I don't believe, but would be great to hear, how you think about that, especially with your background in cow nutrition.
Sure. So as you mentioned, the time frame is a huge aspect of that, as far as grass finishing versus, a grain or a hybrid type of mix. It takes about twice as long for an animal to finish on grass as it would to. Basically, what we're doing is putting a more calorie dense diet in front of these cattle so they would get to an endpoint sooner. So we think about the amount of natural resources that they're consuming just by sheer length of time, that is much less. So with their feed, the water, everything else that an animal is going to consume with those natural resources in that time, that's cut down significantly to get to the same endpoint. It's just in a smaller amount of time. And as you mentioned, of course, for us being in Colorado, we do not have green grass year round. There are a lot of places in the world that do, and they focus really heavily on that grass finish production. But most of their cattle are, from 2 to 3 is the more common, 3 years of age by the time they're actually processed. And when we start talking about the flavor of the beef that's produced, it's very different from a grass finished animal to a grain finished animal. The kind of buttery flavor that we're used to in the U.S., basically, where we have gone to a more of a grain-based diet, grain finishing, that's what we're accustomed to. That's what we like. It's more mild, a little more heartier fat, in my opinion. How else
it's typically more tender.
It is more tender, more flavorful.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and to Jeff's point, on the harvesting side, when you have a grain finished animal that has more back fat, you're able to. What we do is we dry age. So we're able to dry age that whole carcass longer to be able to improve that tenderness and flavor compared to a grass finished animal that just doesn't have that amount of fat, that back fat covering. And to the fat conversation, typically with a grass finished animal, they'll have more of a yellow fat because that comes from the beta carotene in the grass, compared to the white fat that we're accustomed to in a grain finishing situation that has definitely a different flavor profile than a grass finished animal.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And probably the weirdest nuance when we start talking grass finished is a lot of people talk about grass fed. Is this grass fed beef? Is it not?
Right.
And the weirdest thing when you start really diving into that conversation is Grass-fed, when it was regulated by the USDA, which it's no longer regulated, grass-fed basically meant the absence of grain. It didn't mean on pasture. It doesn't mean a lack of antibiotics. It means they were strictly fed a ration that didn't contain grain. So they could be in a feedlot. They could have been doctored, which we support doctoring your animals if they have some sort of a sickness that can be treated, because as stewards of the land and the animals, we need to keep them healthy. And if one does get sick, if you choose not to treat it because it meets a label requirement, we try to stay away from that too. But on the grass-fed side, most cattle are grass-fed the vast majority of their lives. Grass finishing becomes more of a nuance that, from what we've seen in the marketplace, a lot of people really play fast and loose with how to get under that regulation to sell product. And that's one of the things we really try to stay away from, is any sort of abnormal, non-transparent speech that is designed to sell product but not be, totally transparent to the customer. And that's where that grass-finished, grass-fed conversation starts to get very convoluted, aside from environmental concerns and things like that, because we have seen people that are recommended by doctors to go on grass-finished diets for lack of fat. And I'm not even going to begin to talk about that, because Dr. Baker and the rest of the guys in the carnivore sector really understand all those scientific nuances more than we do. But from a producer standpoint, it's a dicey part of the industry, because so many people are espousing knowledge and data points that may or may not be relevant. They're actually confusing the consumer, which is unfortunate, because we have a hard enough time talking to consumers with stuff that we know, let alone stuff they've heard.
Yeah. Well, the grass side, or, grass fed, if we want to talk of the cattle industry, in my mind, that's the superpower of cows, is the fact that they can convert grass or other resources that we can't consume as humans and convert that into an extremely bioavailable, high quality protein. So that's one of the beauties of a cow, because they are a ruminant, and that's their system's designed for that. Mm-hmm. So that's just one of the cool things about cattle in general. And the majority, as Jeff said, the majority of their life, they are grass fed. It's just the nuances of the grain finishing versus the grass finishing
and the labeling. But that may or may not mean. One thing we didn't mention, Scott, about the ranch, it's really interesting. The ground that we ranch on, if you consider it for other agricultural uses, it can't be farmed. We live in the sandhills. If you go to the beach and you see that really grainy sand, that is the same type of ground we have here in eastern Colorado. And I want to say within miles of the ranch, there's nobody farming, because you just can't hold the soil together. The last time anybody in the family farmed was in the 60s. So this is the best utilization of the ground from an economic pursuit within the ag industry that can be done. Yeah. And after 100 years in the same piece of dirt, I think Kara's family's kind of got it nailed down pretty well.
This episode is brought to you by Optimal Carnivore. Optimal Carnivore was created by carnivores for carnivores. They've recently released a new product, a grass-fed bone marrow. It is the whole bone extract, which includes the bone marrow, the cartilage, and collagen peptides. Our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal, including bones, and especially the marrow. All the nutrients and substances that your body needs to build, repair, and maintain your bones, teeth, and connective tissue can come from the bone marrow. It's a complex that contains the same components as home-cooked bone broth, but making bone broth can be a hassle. You have to source high-quality bones, boil them for days, and this is a simple, convenient alternative that's gently freeze-dried so it preserves all the nutrients completely intact. It's perfect for people who are traveling or don't have time to make bone broth themselves. Visit www.amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code carnivore10 to receive 10% off your purchase. It's really interesting because I think the danger here is that consumers are kind of 10% or 5% educated on what grass-fed and grass finishing means. and just enough to have that kind of Dunning-Kruger effect where they think they know a lot more than they do. And so they see grass-fed label all over grocery stores and they think, oh, that's the best quality beef. That's what I need to get. That's what's good for the environment, when really there's so much more nuance around the life cycle of cattle, where grass finishing is possible, labeling, all of these points that you two are raising.
Well, in the bullet point, if I can make it around labeling, is find a rancher and ask them the questions that matter to you, because buying on the label, depending on who's printing the label or who's putting the label on their product, may or may not be what you're after. So if there are things that matter to you and your family, all we recommend is find a rancher and ask them the questions that are important to what you want to have done. Whether that's us, somebody else. We've talked to a lot of people that buy from other ranches, and we encourage them to still do that. If you have a great producer that produces good product, that you like how they produce product, we're not here to poach customers. We're here to engage with customers. And if you need a supplier, we're happy to be that person. But if people are eating beef, we're happy to hear it.
Yeah, that's a great message. And talk a little bit about the slaughter process. I think it would be really interesting and educational for folks to hear that. How do you choose to slaughter your cattle? How has that maybe evolved, and what are some of the choices you made around that?
What in particular are you looking for, Scott?
Just, what happens when the cattle leave the ranch? Who slaughters them? Why did you choose to go with them? Just educate us as if, I'm someone at a cocktail party that knows nothing about slaughtering cattle and how that process is done, and where it gets handed off.
Well, I think Kara's going to take that one, but lovingly, Scott, we call it harvesting, because saying slaughtering at a cocktail party usually is off-putting.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah,
forgive my crassness.
No, it's just been some of the nomenclature changed within the industry, which is interesting even to see, since I was in school and spent quite a bit of time in a meat lab during my college education. But so as far as the harvest process for us, we do have a local USDA processor. So the USDA stamp is key here, because legally we can't sell cuts directly to a consumer or ship across state lines if we are not USDA certified. So all of our cattle they go through a USDA processing facility. So a USDA inspector, makes sure that the process is all on the up and up, and the quality and cleanliness and food safety guidelines are adhered to throughout the harvest process when those cattle actually, are put into a box. And that process really is pretty seamless. I've been in quite a few harvest facilities just within my background and my career, and it really is a humane process, which I know can be kind of hard to wrap our head around. But they're stunned with a captive bolt, so they're rendered unconscious before they are actually become meat. And there's a lot of experts within that field. Temple Grandin is one of them that's helped design these processing facilities to make sure it is the most humane process that we can do. But that USDA certification is a big part of that. And for us, we have a local processor that's great to work with. They custom harvest everything, custom pack, custom cut to a different, whatever specifications that we'd like them to. And then we also do make sure that we dry age everything, which means that at that point they're a carcass, they're halved and hung in a cooler, so the food safety is adhered to, and then stay in there with the dry air circulating for at least 2 weeks before they're actually fabricated down into the individual cuts that you'd see, at the grocery store or in our boxes that we send out to people. And that really enhances that kind of rich flavor profile, as well as the tenderness of the beef. That really, it's just, you aren't able to do that in the large scale beef cattle production, because there's some local processors around here that they're doing 5,000 head a day. So when you think about having to harvest that many cattle, and then fabricate them and get them in a box, they can only stay in their cooler rooms so long because they only have so much space for that. So the fact, that we can age for that extended amount of time is an intricacy to a smaller family-owned operation like ours. So.
Yeah. And one thing, this is kind of a stupid question, but one thing I've always wondered is, cows are harvested and then dry aging for a long time and then shipped to a grocery store commonly. And I'm just wondering around like expiration times, because why is it that they can dry age for so long and so many different variants of how long? You can dry age for weeks or months. And then all of a sudden, once it's put in the grocery store, particularly if it's ground beef, it has this expiration date that seems so soon relative to that whole process. So what is it in the actual packaging, or at what stage does kind of this clock start where the meat is going to expire sooner? Or maybe what are some of the things that cause meat to expire over the life cycle?
So there's a few nuances to that, Scott. So what we're talking about on the dry aging side is a whole carcass, and then the whole carcass is broken down into steaks and shipped out individually.
Right.
When you start talking about, I went to the local butcher, he had a 90-day dry aged ribeye. What he had was he got a ribeye primal and put it in an aging locker. They make special aging machines where you can actually age your own beef. And what ages that beef is exposure to oxygen, things like that, but in a dry environment, so that it's actually done in a dry manner. So it seals the outside and then it ages. When you hear the process of wet aging, that's something else that a lot of people try to do. And that is when you get a large cut of meat from, call it a processor, and it's never been frozen. That's a big nuance to this, because once you freeze that product, whether it's coming from us or from the big packers or wherever, once that is frozen, the enzymes stop working that actually make the aging process happen. So when you get a piece of meat in Massachusetts that says 90-day dry aged ribeye, that ribeye would have been processed out, shipped typically to the steakhouse, because there's not a lot of very large dry aging facilities on a cut by cut basis, especially in the national chain or the national supply chain. So when you get a 90-day dry aged ribeye at your local butcher, that butcher would have received a fresh ribeye from the processor, put that into their dry aging machine, and then carved it out after that timeline. They aren't getting those dry aged ribeyes from the national supply chain because that infrastructure doesn't exist. That's more of a craft niche type environment, because it's owning meat for a long time. It dries out a lot, so you lose a lot of weight. So you get a lot of shrink, and economically it has to be niche because doing it at large scale is pretty tough.
Got it.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. That makes a lot more sense. And can you talk, since we're on the topic of kind of direct to consumer versus distributing through stores, grocery stores, or other, what are your opinions on direct to consumer, and maybe how you think it's changing some of the challenges you're facing with it?
Direct to consumer is certainly growing, not only from consumer demand, but just from technology, of course. The amount of plugins we can put into the back end of the website to start to automate our processes just since the business launched a few years ago is pretty incredible. But if you consider our business 15 years ago, when people were barely getting into smartphones, et cetera, the ability to reach consumers now is better than it's ever been. And being able to really reach out to the right groups is one of those things that's helped us a lot. The carnivore community, the keto community, to all of you listening that are in those communities, thank you so much for the support, because the carnivore diet's allowed me to lose 25 pounds so far.
Wow.
But the consumer side is getting more and more prevalent, especially when talking to our customers. People are excited to know who to call. Hey, what about this beef? Hey, can I get this for a party? My daughter's graduating high school in 2 weeks. Can I get brisket for my party? And they love to talk about where it came from. So that connection back to agriculture, I think, is growing. And after all of the supply chain issues that happened during COVID, I think a lot of people want to know that they have someone to talk to. And that's one of the things we've been fighting through. Actually, that's why I called you yesterday to tell you your box got delayed, because we can only
nice.
fast. Thank you. And, for all of the nuance out there, the consuming public wants to know more. They can demand more, and they have the ability to get more information than ever. So it's becoming a way to connect with consumers and meet their demands, while also, in a lot of cases, making friends when you go to events with Redmond Real Salt or any of those people, because you're just running into great people everywhere you go.
Yeah.
And to
go ahead.
Point, Scott, one of the first stories that I shared about the consumer connection that kind of drove us towards craft beef, within the industry, we had used the jargon of we want to educate our consumers, but we took a little bit of a different spin on that, and we're like, we don't necessarily want to educate consumers, we want to engage with them. So having the conversation about where your beef comes from and knowing who raised it, and just having the kind of conversations that we're having right now, that was a big driver into starting Colorado Craft Beef to begin with.
Yeah. And Jeff, just because you brought it up, I thought it was extremely thoughtful, the actual reason why my box was delayed and why you called me about it. Do you want to share that?
Oh, of course. Well, your box was delayed because we shipped 2 whole beef yesterday, and there's only so much beef on 2 steers. We have luckily gotten through what I think is the worst of the COVID spring outbreak, but we got into kind of a pickle throughout the spring because we were shipping beef to people that were immunocompromised or medical professionals, and they were moving to the top of the list. And that has created a juggling act of epic proportions for the last couple of months. And, to anybody listening that's a current customer, we can't say enough thank yous for the amount of gracious responses we've had, and understanding of, we've got to build a business and we've got to take some time to get the cattle done correctly. And everybody's just been great to deal with. And we have had some people request refunds because they couldn't wait 3 weeks. And we appreciate that too. Just some good, transparent communication and more of a tribe and a team type mentality. And everybody's just been great to work with. And it's been fun. We've done some things on the business side that will hopefully minimize the chances of us getting put in this type of predicament again. We've actually got a walk-in freezer ordered and some other things going on at the ranch. They're going to allow us to minimize those supply chain hiccups going forward. But all of that's only possible because of great customers, people that appreciate the beef industry and want to know where their food comes from. And we can't be more humble in saying thank you to everybody.
Yeah, that's incredible. And can you talk a little bit about how your operation has changed over time and maybe where you'd like to take it with regards to scaling, distribution, how you're working with consumers, some of those pieces?
Yeah. Scaling is something we've always been looking at as far as growing the business. There's so much ground we have, or so much opportunity at the ranch to grow the business. We want to maximize that while still doing our customers justice of getting great product. So there's a balancing act right now of how big and how fast do we get, or do we grow to service our customers the best way possible? Because I think one of the things that people have shared with us the most is our customer service and our dedication to making sure everybody is happy. So growing the business is certainly a priority, but doing it well, I would argue, is a bigger priority. So we're having those conversations between Kara and I. To date, 99% of all the ranch work and the beef business has been done by Kara and I solely. We don't have any employees. And the ability to do that while juggling everything else, including a 6-month-old baby at this point, again, it's been a challenge, but it's been fun.
Yeah.
And, when we started out with a kind of a beta test of we'd like to grow cattle this way. And Kara has, I would hate to guess how many hours of time and energy in the education sector, just learning everything she knows about cattle and how they produce the high quality protein they do. But even the beta test with all that science backup, we were curious to see how it came out, how the cattle would turn out, how things would taste, how do you ship things, and putting that entire process together so that we as Jeff and Kara can ship beef to you, Scott, in Massachusetts and have it show up the same in Massachusetts as it does to Dr. Baker in California, or a good buddy of ours, actually, who's one of our subscribers, Ryan from Key West, who's spending his summer in Massachusetts. I'm sure he's around you somewhere right now. Everybody's got to have the same experience, and we don't have the reach of some of our big competitors. And we're doing it very much by the bootstraps from the ranch. And it's been fun putting it together. Growing it is paramount, but also growing it well is much more important than any of it.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful of you. And what is it like working together as a couple? How has that been? How has that shaped your relationship? I'm sure it's been interesting and an adventure.
I appreciate you putting me on the spot. While I have nowhere,
nowhere to run.
I would love to hear Kara's response to that. My response is business is business, and Kara and I have a complementary set of skills. I'm pretty good with numbers. I come from a very number-heavy business background, and with her ability to be the cow nerd, we've got a pretty defined set of responsibilities that really don't cross over that much. I don't really think it's caused any issues. I think it's been kind of interesting, but we come from two different schools of thought. So there's just been the natural feeling out process of who wants what out of the business. And then how do we marry the science side of raising cattle to be the best beef possible with the monetary side or scheduling side of, I have people that need beef. We need to make them ready today, which isn't a reasonable request from the money guy to the science person, but it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, we are blessed in the fact that we do have those complementary skills. Because, just to Jeff's comment there about, trying to get cattle ready sooner, I have kind of the side of, the live cattle and, the husbandry and all of the things that go into it that has to be balanced still with economics. And, you could open a can of worms and talk about, it's just the sustainability of ag and food production. And those things really do need to be balanced of, your resources, your land, your animals, but also there still is an economic piece of that and a business. And most agriculture businesses are just that. They're family-owned businesses. And there's always the funny memes out there, though, of just if you have issues within your relationship, go work cattle and you'll work them out. But that's have those kinds of fun conversations. But it really is a complementary thing, and we work well together. So.
Yeah, I like that. There's work to be done, so no time for fighting.
I don't get a lot of backlash when I say I have to go work on a spreadsheet. Kara is happy to let me go to my office and do that.
Yeah, I'll try that one. And let's talk a little bit about your carnivore experiment, Jeff. And I don't know if you partook at all, Kara, but great to hear your input as well. What made you decide to try the diet, and how has it worked for you?
Well, I know I've mentioned Dr. Baker a couple of times. Dr. Sean Baker was at an event with Redmond Real Salt in Omaha that Dr. Fit and Fab Jamie Seaman put on. And I believe the group of people that had me I don't know if convinced is the right word. Buffaloed might be more accurate. Brandon Scott, formerly Keto Carnivore King, Danny Vega, and Dr. Baker, and Jamie Seaman's wife, Sergeant Fit and Fabulous Ben. Whoops. Dr. Seaman's husband, Ben, not wife. Sorry, Ben. My bad, dude. I think they all collectively looked at me, and I wrote an article about this, and Danny Vega shared it. And I've always been a bigger guy. I'm 6'3", 260, 280 whenever I really think about it. And I've always said, oh, I'm a bigger guy. Whatever. I'm too busy working multiple jobs, whatever it may be. And Dr. Baker, with a really kind heart, looked at me and said, brother, you own a beef company. You have no excuse to not have at least tried the carnivore diet. Give it 90 days. You have to.
Yeah, that's great.
And he then, 5 minutes later told Danny Vega, hey, Jeff's going to do carnivore. And Danny started telling everybody. And by the time the event was over, Dr. Baker had posted the next morning on Instagram that I was going to do it. And Kara and I were driving home from the event, and she said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't think I have a choice at this point. I think it would be political suicide to not take a chance and see what it is. And I was blown away. I actually just converted a good friend of mine who, believe it or not, is a wheat farmer in Pendleton, Oregon, to the carnivore diet. So you've got a guy literally growing wheat, gluten. They raise mustard and a bunch of other things. Turned him onto the carnivore diet. And he called me just a week ago and said, dude, I'm 2 weeks into this thing. This is outstanding. And so just the how well I felt on the carnivore diet was unbelievable. We work a lot at the ranch. We've got a lot of things going on. And, to have a 12 or 15 hour working day is not uncommon. We're out of bed every day by 4:30 or 5. I think today was 5:30. But there's no shortage of work to do. And that afternoon crash on the carnivore diet went away. I really enjoyed not having to think about what I was going to eat. That was actually really convenient. But I was really blown away. And the thing that scientifically really made me pay attention, I'm 37 and I got my commercial driver's license, my semi-driving license when I was 22. And from the time I was 22 to the time I was 37, mind you, when you have your CDL, you have to have a physical every 2 years. And in that physical, they test your blood pressure, your eyesight, all the stuff to make sure that if you're driving a semi down the freeway, you probably aren't going to pass out. And from the time I was 22 until this most recent physical, I'd always tested high on my blood pressure. And they'd always attributed it to, doctor's offices make you nervous. They'd retest you 20 minutes later and then let you go along your way. About 75 days into the 90 days that I started on the carnivore diet, I went in for my just every 2 year physical. And for the first time in my adult life, my blood pressure was in the perfect range, no questions at all.
Wow.
And that really made me pay attention because I've always been a big guy. I've always had a reason why I was carrying a little too much weight. But the blood pressure thing has always really worried me in the back of my mind. I'm 37 and getting a little older. Blood pressure is a bit of a big deal if you let it go too long. And to see that kind of a data point come through was really eye-opening. And not saying carnivore is the only way to do it, but gosh, it worked for me. And I'm down 25 pounds since our daughter was born 6 months ago. I've not been very diligent on the diet the last 45 days, but we're going to get back in the swing of things. And most notably, I lost the weight and it's not came back. In 45 days of really not monitoring things very tightly, that weight has stayed off. And if you can get it off and keep it off, I think that's the hardest thing for most people to do. And this seems to be doing it.
Yeah, that's super impressive. And I had read the story on Fat Fueled Family on Danny Vega's blog, but it's so great to hear it right from your mouth, Jeff. And I just want to circle back to, consumers in Colorado craft beef. What can consumers in today's age, especially when we're hearing about, the struggles of ranchers and, the whole beef industry. A lot of it, I'm sure, is media sensationalizing things, but what can they do to help support, companies like Colorado Craft Beef and others? Obviously there's purchasing, but what else can they do, that you would recommend or suggest?
That's a great question. You want to take first crack at it, Kara?
Well, of course, as you mentioned, Scott, of purchasing from companies, when you speak with your dollars, that makes a big difference. But also, just for me, and part of the reason that we started this endeavor is within the beef industry, we're so far segmented from our end product typically, whether we raise calves or yearlings or, we're in the feeder sector, we're just so far removed from the fact that, we're actually truly raising beef at the end of the day. So across the board, I just ask that consumers eat beef, because that does come back to the ranchers that are producing this beef, because that is their end product. Whether we may think about it or not, that truly is. We're producing beef every day. Mm-hmm. Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
If you've got questions in the beef industry, seek the answers. And by seek the answers, I don't mean Google it. I mean call somebody. Talk to somebody in the space. There's a lot of weird labels out there that people choose to put out, a lot of weird marketing ploys. But if you personally have something that really matters to you and your family, and that's how you make your purchasing decisions, find the right answer and reach out to ranchers to see if they do that. And then ask them if it's even possible. Because there's, a great example, I mentioned Kara's family hasn't farmed here since the 50s or the 60s, something like that. Well, the reason they don't is for 40 years they tried it. They learned something about this ground that you couldn't learn by just walking around. For a lot of consumers to question commercial, long-standing operations, let's not forget that those people and their families have been working that same ground for generations and generations. So let's respect where they're coming from and ask good questions and engage with producers and don't read Google and assume that it's correct, because I've seen a lot of stuff that comes out about ag that is just not, some of it's not even relevant. We saw a website recently that mentioned that grass-finished beef is better because it doesn't support a certain strain of E. coli. But if you look at that strain of E. coli, humans don't synthesize. It doesn't come into humans. So they've got a data point on their website talking about grass finished is good because it doesn't hold this type of E. coli, but that type of E. coli doesn't matter to humans.
Yeah.
And they don't share that, and they don't say really a positive or negative about it, but it's kind of fear mongering and grandstanding to try to get people to say, oh, I have to do this. And that's unfortunate, because in the ag industry, and to any ag producers out there listening, let's stop beating each other up. Agriculture is 1% to 2% of the total population, and we've got to feed everybody. Colorado craft beef couldn't feed all of Denver. It's just impossible to do. What we can raise as a company is only so much. We need all the other ranchers doing what they do to feed our population. And what we need to do as producers and ranchers is stop trying to get ahead by standing on the throats of our brothers and sisters in ag.
Yeah, I really like that. Stop throwing each other under the bus. Everyone's on the same team. Well, this has been fantastic, Jeff and Kara. Really appreciate you both coming on the show, taking the time to speak with me and share with the listeners a bit more about the history and the modern day of Colorado craft beef. I'll provide links to the website, and where else can folks find out more about you?
Our phone number's on the website. If you want to give us a call, please do. It rings straight through to my cell phone. We'd like to have people reach out. We'd like to have conversations. if you've got questions about the industry, or if you're not even anywhere near Colorado, we ship nationwide. But if you say, hey, what can I find in Georgia? We might know some people. We're about being a part of the community, and we're happy to do that. So I think we're going to be reaching out on some other channels as well. But just stay connected. Love where your food comes from and appreciate what people are doing.
Yeah, people can find us on our social channels too, Scott, at Colorado Craft Beef.
Great. I'll link to all those in the show notes as well. Well, thank you both very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I know things are crazy over there right now, and I'm sure folks will really enjoy this.
Thanks, Scott. We appreciate your time today.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.